On the morning of January 16th, 1979, a Boeing 707 sat on the runway at Mehrabad Airport in Tehran. At the controls was the pilot Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the King of Kings, the Light of the Aryans, the Shah of Iran. Beside him sat his wife, Empress Farah. Below them, on the tarmac, Iranian generals wept openly as the plane taxied away. The official story, the one broadcast to the Iranian people that day, was that the Shah and his family were leaving for a vacation. A rest, a short trip abroad while things calmed down at home. He would be back soon, everyone was told. He believed it too, or at least he said he did. He never saw Iran again. 13 months later, he was dead. Buried not in the marble mausoleum his father had built for the dynasty outside Tehran, but in a borrowed tomb in Cairo, thousands of miles from the throne his family had held for barely half a century. And the story of what happened to the rest of his family after that morning in January 1979 is one of the strangest, saddest, and most unfinished chapters in the entire history of fallen monarchies. Because unlike almost every other royal family that lost everything in the 20th century, the Pahlavis are not a closed case. Their story doesn't end in a museum exhibit or a quiet aristocratic retirement in the Alps. As you're watching this, in the summer of 2026, a member of that exiled family is standing in front of television cameras in Washington and Paris, telling the world he is ready to go home. Whether he ever will is a question nobody, not even him, can answer yet. So let's go back to where it started, because to understand how strange and violent this family's downfall was, you first have to understand how strange and sudden their rise had been. The Pahlavi dynasty did not descend from centuries of kings. It was barely 54 years old when it collapsed. Its founder, a man named Reza Khan, was born into modest circumstances and joined the Persian Cossack Brigade as a teenager, working his way up through the ranks on raw physical presence and battlefield instinct rather than noble blood. In 1921, he led a coup that put him in effective control of the Iranian military. 2 years later, he was prime minister. And in December 1925, the Iranian parliament, the Majlis, formally deposed the exhausted Qajar dynasty that had ruled Persia for over a century and installed Reza Khan on the throne instead. He took the name Reza Shah Pahlavi. Persia had a new royal family, and it had been built from nothing in less than 5 years. Reza Shah ruled the way he had fought his way to power, ruthlessly, and with an obsessive drive to drag his country into the modern world, whether it wanted to go or not. He built the Trans-Iranian Railway. He founded a modern university system. He forced the country's official name to change from Persia to Iran in 1935. He stripped the clergy of much of their traditional authority, banned the veil in public, and built roads, factories, and a national army almost from scratch. He also ruled as an authoritarian, jailing critics, seizing land for himself until he had become the largest private landowner in the country, and crushing dissent without much patience for due process. It is a pattern that should sound familiar by the end of this video, because his son would repeat almost every part of it on a much larger stage, with much larger consequences. And then came the first exile. In the summer of 1941, with the Second World War tearing through Europe, Reza Shah's government made the mistake of tilting toward Nazi Germany for industrial and technical support. Britain and the Soviet Union, desperate to secure a supply corridor through Iran to arm the USSR, invaded the country in August 1941, within weeks. The same man who had built modern Iran out of nothing was forced to abdicate in favor of his 22-year-old son, Mohammad Reza. The British shipped the deposed king out of his own country like cargo. First to Mauritius, where he lived in a damp colonial villa called the Chateau Val d'Ori, then to Durban. Then finally, to a modest house on Young Avenue in the Parktown neighborhood of Johannesburg, South Africa, a city whose orderly streets and busy modernity reportedly impressed him more than almost anything he'd seen at home. He never got to use any of it. On July 26, 1944, Reza Shah died in that house of a heart ailment he had been fighting for years. He was 66 years old, and he had been forced from his own capital by foreign armies. It was, in miniature, a preview of exactly what would happen to his son 38 years later. Except that this time, nobody was watching closely enough to learn the lesson. Mohammad Reza Shah inherited a throne under foreign occupation at 22, and for the first decade of his reign, he was widely regarded as a weak, uncertain figurehead, easily overshadowed by the country's elected politicians. Nowhere was that clearer than in 1953. When Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, a fierce Iranian nationalist, nationalized the country's British-controlled oil industry and effectively sidelined the young Shah's authority entirely. The Shah tried to dismiss Mossadegh by royal decree. It failed. Riots broke out. And on August 16, 1953, in a moment almost nobody remembers today because of what came later, Mohammad Reza Shah did exactly what his son would one day watch him rehearse. He fled his own country, first to Baghdad, then to a hotel room in Rome, uncertain whether he would ever rule again. 4 days later, a coup organized by the American CIA and British intelligence overthrew Mossadegh and put the Shah back on his throne. He returned to Tehran in triumph. It felt at the time like a footnote, In hindsight, it was a dress rehearsal for Exile that the Shah passed through and then completely failed to learn from. The next 25 years were the peak of Pahlavi power and the peak of Pahlavi excess. Flush with American backing after the 1953 coup and torrents of oil revenue through the 1960s and 70s, the Shah launched what he called the White Revolution, land reform, an expanded literacy corps, and voting rights for women. Genuinely significant modernizing achievements that sat uneasily alongside a growing culture of surveillance and repression enforced by his secret police, SAVAK. In 1967, in a break with more than 2,000 years of Persian royal tradition in which no queen consort had ever been formally crowned, the Shah staged an elaborate coronation for his third wife, Farah, crowning her Shahbanu, Empress of Iran, in a ceremony of staggering, jewel-encrusted extravagance. 4 years later, he went even further, hosting a lavish international celebration at the ruins of Persepolis to mark 2,500 years of Persian monarchy, flying in kings and presidents from around the world to dine under silk tents in the desert while much of the Iranian population outside those tents lived in poverty. It was the kind of spectacle that photographs beautifully and ages terribly. Because underneath the champagne and the imported French chefs, the same forces that had toppled monarchies in Russia, Germany, and Austria a half-century earlier were quietly gathering. Economic inequality, a repressed clergy waiting for its moment, and a population that had watched the crown grow richer while ordinary Iranians grew angrier. By 1977 and 1978, that anger had a leader. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, a Shia cleric who had spent 15 years in exile after publicly denouncing the Shah, became the unifying figure for a revolution that drew in students, merchants, leftists, and the devout alike. An alliance that agreed on almost nothing except that the Shah had to go. Strikes crippled the oil industry. Protests swelled into the millions. The Shah, weakened by an undisclosed cancer diagnosis he was hiding even from his own generals, hesitated between crackdown and compromise, and ultimately achieved neither. And so, on that morning in January 1979, with the country ungovernable and the army beginning to fracture, he took off from Mehrabad Airport for the second and final time in his life, this time with no coup waiting in the wings to bring him home. What followed was one of the strangest odysseys any deposed monarch has ever been forced onto. The Shah and Empress Farah landed first in Aswan, Egypt, at the personal invitation of President Anwar Sadat, where, in one of history's odder coincidences, they crossed paths with former U.S. President Gerald Ford, who happened to be touring the region at the same time. From Egypt, they flew to Morocco as guests of King Hassan II. From Morocco to Paradise Island in the Bahamas. From the Bahamas to Mexico. Nowhere felt permanent. Nowhere felt safe. And on October 22nd, 1979, the Shah was finally allowed into the United States, not as a political guest, but as a cancer patient seeking treatment for the lymphoma that had been slowly killing him for years. The decision detonated a crisis nobody in Washington had fully anticipated. 12 days later, on November 4th, 1979, Islamist militants stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and seized 52 American hostages, demanding the Shah be sent back to Iran to face trial in exchange for their release. The United States refused. The hostages would not be freed for 444 days. A dying man's medical treatment had become one of the defining international crises of the decade. The Shah's own final months were almost unbearably lonely by comparison. Unwelcome to stay indefinitely in the United States, he moved on to Panama and finally back to Egypt, the only country whose leader never once wavered in offering him shelter. He died in a military hospital in Cairo on July 27, 1980, at the age of 60, having lost a spleen, a battle with lymphoma, and an empire, all within the space of about 18 months. President Sadat gave him a full state funeral 3 days later at the Al-Rifa'i Mosque in Cairo, attended by former President Richard Nixon and the exiled King Constantine II of Greece, one deposed monarch paying his respects to another. It is difficult to overstate how far this was from the death his father had once imagined for him. The Shah is buried in Cairo to this day. Iran's post-revolutionary government has never invited his remains home, and the Pahlavis have never formally asked. For decades afterward, Iran's new Islamic Republic pushed a specific narrative about what happened to the wealth the family left behind, that the Shah had looted the treasury and smuggled a fortune abroad through a charitable body called the Pahlavi Foundation, with some estimates in the years right after the revolution running as high as $20 billion. The reality, as far as international courts have been able to establish it, is considerably murkier and much less generous to that theory than the accusation suggests. An international tribunal, set up specifically to adjudicate claims between the United States and Iran, spent years examining the Pahlavi family's finances, and, in a lengthy 2000 ruling, rejected the overwhelming majority of the Islamic Republic's claims against Mohammad Reza Shah, Empress Farah, and his sisters. Dozens of separate lawsuits filed in American courts against family members were dismissed for lack of evidence. Whatever the family retained when they fled, it was nowhere near the treasury of a fallen empire. And it did not spare them from what came next. Because while the world remembers the Shah's death, it tends to forget that his was not the only violent or tragic end in that family, not by a long distance. If you want to understand the true cost of the 1979 revolution to the House of Pahlavi, you have to look at the people who scattered in his wake. Start with his twin sister, Princess Ashraf Pahlavi. If Mohammad Reza was the public face of the monarchy, Ashraf was widely believed to be its iron will, a fierce, glamorous, and deeply controversial political operator who had played a direct hand in orchestrating the 1953 counter-coup that saved her brother's throne in the first place. She campaigned internationally for women's rights, served for over a decade as Iran's representative at the United Nations, and cultivated a public image so striking that Andy Warhol painted her portrait. The French press, only half-jokingly, nicknamed her La Panthère Noire, the Black Panther, for her taste in gambling and glamour on the Riviera. She had already survived an assassination attempt in Cannes in 1977, an attack that killed one of her aides. After the revolution, she scattered between exile addresses in France, New York, and Monaco, never softening her defense of the monarchy for a single day. But her exile was marked by a string of personal catastrophes almost too brutal to summarize. Her son, Shahryar Shafiq, a captain in the former Imperial Iranian Navy who had fought the revolution until the very end before fleeing to Paris, was gunned down on a Paris street on December 7, 1979, assassinated by agents of the new Islamic Republic in one of a string of killings targeting exiled royals abroad. Her twin brother, the Shah, died of cancer only months later. 2 decades after that, her niece would die of an overdose in a London hotel. A decade after that, her nephew would take his own life in Boston. Princess Ashraf outlived nearly all of them, dying in Monte Carlo on January 7, 2016, at the age of 96, having spent 37 years in exile mourning a family that kept losing people to violence and despair, even after the revolution that scattered them was decades in the past. The Shah's elder sister, Princess Shams Pahlavi, who had once headed Iran's Red Lion and Sun Society, the Iranian equivalent of the Red Cross, fled to the United States after 1979 and died quietly in Santa Barbara, California in 1996, one of the less publicly tumultuous exits in a family that rarely got them. Then there were the Shah's own children by Empress Farah, 4 young people who had grown up inside the gilded, guarded walls of Niavaran Palace in Tehran and were suddenly thrown into a life of hotel suites, bodyguards, and boarding schools in countries whose languages some of them barely spoke. Princess Leyla Pahlavi was only 9 years old when her family fled Iran. She grew up largely in the United States, attending the United Nations International School in New York, and later studying literature and philosophy at Brown University, dividing her adult years between America and Paris, fluent in 3 languages, and, by every account from people close to her, quietly struggling underneath the carefully composed public exterior. On June 10, 2001, Princess Leyla was found dead in her room at the Leonard Hotel in London. An inquest concluded she had died of an overdose of barbiturates, with cocaine also present in her system. She was 31 years old. She was buried at the Passy Cemetery in Paris, the same cemetery that holds a number of other exiled European aristocrats whose families lost their thrones long before hers did. 10 years later, tragedy struck the family again. Prince Ali Reza Pahlavi, the Shah's younger son, and after 1980, the heir presumptive to the headship of the deposed dynasty, had built a life for himself studying ancient Iranian and Zoroastrian history, earning a place at Princeton and later at Columbia. But he had also battled depression for years, worsened, according to those close to him, by the crushing weight of representing a country and a crown he had barely lived in and could never return to. On January 4, 2011, Ali Reza took his own life at his home in Boston. He was 44. 7 months later, his partner, Raha Didavar, gave birth to his daughter, a girl the family named Iriana Layla, in memory of the aunt she would never meet, who had died in almost identical circumstances a decade before her. Empress Farah, meanwhile, absorbed nearly all of it. She had been at her husband's bedside through his final illness in Cairo, briefly served as regent of the exiled house for 3 months until her eldest son turned 20 and formally assumed headship of the family, and then spent the following 4.5 decades burying her husband, her brother-in-law, a nephew, and 2 of her own 4 children, all without ever setting foot in Iran again. She has spent much of her exile dividing her time between Paris and the United States, running a foundation dedicated to Iranian art and culture and giving interviews in which she speaks, almost without exception, with a controlled and dignified grief rather than bitterness. She turned 88 this past October. She has now outlived her husband by 46 years, longer than the entire Pahlavi dynasty itself managed to survive in power, which brings us, finally, to the son who is still standing, and to the part of this story that, unlike almost every other exiled royal family history you will ever watch a video about, does not actually have an ending yet. Reza Pahlavi was 17 years old and already out of the country, training as a fighter pilot in the United States, when the revolution that would end his family's rule finally toppled his father's government. He has not set foot in Iran since. He studied political science in America, built a life and a marriage there with his wife Yasmin and their 3 daughters, and, on his 20th birthday in October 1980, formally assumed the headship of the exiled house of Pahlavi from his mother, styling himself, to a diaspora of monarchist supporters at least, as Iran's Shah in exile. For most of the following 4 decades, he lived the recognizable, slightly wistful life of a professional pretender, founding an opposition organization called the National Council of Iran, giving the occasional speech, meeting with Western officials who were polite but rarely committal, watching his cause slowly fade from a living political movement into a diaspora nostalgia project, as the Islamic Republic he opposed marked its 30th, then 40th, then well past its 50th anniversary, still firmly in power, and then, starting in the final weeks of 2025, something changed, and it changed fast enough that this video cannot responsibly tell you how it ends. Because as of this recording, in August 2026, nobody knows yet. Mass anti-government protests broke out across Iran in December 2025, driven by economic collapse, fuel shortages, and years of accumulated fury at a regime that had spent decades promising prosperity and delivering repression instead. Reza Pahlavi, watching from Washington and Paris, threw himself into the moment with a fervor his decades of quiet advocacy had rarely shown. He called on Iran's security forces to lay down their weapons and side with the protesters. Iranian state television was briefly hacked to broadcast his image and message directly into millions of homes. He declared February 14, 2026, a global day of action, and rallies in his name drew enormous, genuinely startling crowds in Los Angeles, Toronto, and Munich, diaspora Iranians waving the old pre-revolutionary lion and sun flag his father had ruled under. Then, on February 28, 2026, the crisis escalated into something far larger than street protests. The United States and Israel launched a coordinated military campaign against Iran, later referred to as the 2026 Iran War, targeting the regime's military and nuclear infrastructure. In the opening strikes, Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, the man who had ruled the Islamic Republic since 1989, was killed, along with dozens of senior officials, plunging the country's leadership into a crisis it had never faced in its history. After a chaotic interim period, Iran's Assembly of Experts selected Khamenei's son, Mujtaba, as the new supreme leader on March 8, 2026. The war continued for months afterward, and as of this summer, the country's overlapping power centers, the clerical establishment, the Revolutionary Guard, and a wounded but unbroken security apparatus, are still fighting over what comes next, with no resolution in sight. Reza Pahlavi, for his part, has positioned himself squarely at the center of the story, touring capitals and conferences with a message aimed as much at Western audiences as Iranian ones. He addressed a standing ovation at the Conservative Political Action Conference in Texas in March 2026. He spoke before the Swedish Parliament in April. He has told reporters and rally crowds alike, almost word for word, the same line, that the Islamic Republic will fall, not if but when, and that he intends to return and help lead Iran through whatever comes after. Human rights monitors tracking the unrest have reported thousands of arrests and, by some counts, thousands of deaths across the protest crackdowns and the war itself, figures that remain contested and difficult to verify independently in real time. Pahlavi's critics, including rival opposition figures inside the fractured Iranian diaspora, question whether a man who has not lived in the country since he was a teenager, who has no formal political mandate, and whose own movement has struggled for decades to unify Iran's exile community, can credibly claim to speak for a nation of nearly 90 million people who have never voted on the matter. His supporters counter that, in a moment of genuine vacuum, his name and his family's history, however complicated, may be the only unifying symbol available. As of today, both arguments remain exactly that. Arguments with the actual outcome still unwritten. It is a genuinely strange position for a family's story to be in. Every other exiled royal house you could make a video like this about has by now been quietly absorbed into history. The Ottomans reconciled with modern Turkey decades ago and now show up on television documentaries. The Habsburgs sit on museum foundation boards and negotiate art settlements with the German and Austrian governments. The Hohenzollerns argue over compensation for expropriated palaces in front of parliamentary committees. Their stories have endings, even messy, unsatisfying ones. The Pahlavis do not yet. Mohammad Reza Shah spent the final year of his life being shuttled from country to country by governments too nervous to let him stay, dying in a borrowed hospital bed in Cairo, believing until nearly the end that he might one day go home. 46 years later, his son is standing on stages in Texas and Stockholm, saying almost exactly the same thing. Whether Reza Pahlavi ever lands on that same runway his father took off from in January 1979, whether as a private citizen, a transitional leader, or nothing at all, is not a question this video can answer, because it genuinely has not been decided yet. What is certain is the cost the family has already paid to get to this uncertain point. A founder who died in a foreign house he never wanted to live in, a son who died in a borrowed tomb, a sister who buried her own murdered child, a daughter who overdosed alone in a hotel room, another son who couldn't outrun the weight of a crown that no longer existed, and a widow who has now spent nearly half a century mourning all of them from countries that were never supposed to be home. That is the real story of what happened to Iran's royal family after the empire fell. Not a clean collapse followed by a quiet exile, but 47 years of scattered grief that is, as of this very summer, still not finished being written. If you found this story as staggering as I did, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps the channel grow, and it means I can keep making deep dives into the histories that are still shaping the world right now, whether we're paying attention or not. Drop a comment and let me know what you think. Is Reza Pahlavi's story a genuine second act, or a family clinging to a throne that history has already moved past? I'll see you in the next one.